Welcome to the second webinar in our three-part webinar series on Microsoft 365 Copilot. My name is Mike Tansey. I'm the head of sales at Chess, and with me today I have the brilliant James Mallalieu, our senior AI and Microsoft 365 consultant. So in today's session, James and I will be running through some Microsoft 365 Copilot demos. We'll be talking about the importance of getting your data Copilot ready. And by the end of today, what we hope is that you'll leave with a clear understanding of the data risks and considerations for Copilot. And we'll also gain the knowledge to move forwards with confidence in your Copilot journey. So it's important to note it is, as I mentioned, a three-part webinar series. So come along, join us for the third session around bringing the users along to that journey. It's all very well getting all the technical and the governance side in, but it's the users that are going to make the difference. So register in the link in the chat. For those that haven't been to a Chess webinar before, I'll run you through just a little bit of housekeeping. So the session is being recorded, a copy of which will be made available to you tomorrow. For any questions, we're saving 15 minutes at the end of the webinar. But if you want to post your questions as you go, so don't forget, and please use the Q&A at the top of the screen. And finally, we're offering a one-to-one workshop for each of the companies here today. Now, this is a consultant-led session to discuss your specific Microsoft 365 scenarios around Copilot with James and the team. Take us up on this, simply tick the request follow-up box on the survey or scan the QR code, which will come later on in the presentation. Okay, so before I hand over to James, I'll cover off a very quick overview for Chess. So we are one of the UK's leading independent technology service providers, dedicated to making it easy for businesses to work securely, anywhere, anytime. We have a team of 280 IT professionals supporting over 18,000 customers, and we turn over just over 50 million annually. We offer a comprehensive range of services across 6 key areas. So going down the list on the screen, so Connect for your internet, mobile voice and data needs. Cloud for any infrastructure, platform or software as a service offerings. Devices for your laptops, hardware and networking components. Digital services, now this covers AI, Microsoft 365, Power Platform and data services. Security for the end-to-end security services ranging from pen tests and cyber essentials, right the way through to managed SOCs, combined with the strength of our sister company, CyberLab. And lastly, professional services, providing consultancy, project management, user adoption and managed services. And really our mission at Chess is to help businesses reduce cost, protect data and work better together using technology and forming those long-term strategic partnerships. And that's Chess in a slide. So now I'll pass over to James to kick off the webinar. James, over to you, please.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. So over the next 40 or so minutes, we're going to be talking about Microsoft 365 Copilot. And in this session, my objective is to help you understand what content Copilot has access to, some potential considerations and risks that you might want to be aware of in terms of that content, and also some methods and approaches to address those risks. Now, we have left time at the end for questions, so if you've got any questions as I go through, please feel free to add them in the chat and we'll get around to them at the end of the session. Now, just as a starter to make sure we're all on the same page here, we're talking about Microsoft 365 Copilot, not the millions of other Copilot instances that Microsoft talk about. And in Microsoft 365, there are effectively 2 editions of Copilot. The first one, which is called Microsoft 365 Copilot Chat, is effectively free to anyone that already has a Microsoft 365 license. So pretty much anyone that has a mailbox in your environment will have this tool available to them. And what this instance of Copilot allows them to do is to generate content based on information that exists out in the public domain, i.e. information on the internet. The tool itself provides enterprise data protection, which means the prompts that people type into it and the responses that it generates are not being used to train large language models, and the information will not be pushed out into the public domain. On the other side, we have Microsoft 365 Copilot. Apologies on behalf of Microsoft for their not so clear naming convention here. But essentially, this is the edition of Copilot that has access to content within your Microsoft 365 environment. This is a paid for license, and it's usually paid for on a monthly basis. And this is the tool that we're really going to focus on today, primarily because this is the tool that has access to the information within your environment. Okay. Now, as a quick demo, I've gone into Copilot, and just heads up, this is the new user interface that Microsoft's rolling out for Copilot. If what you see in your own environments is subtly different, i.e. all of your menus are on the right, this is effectively the same thing. This is just the changes they are making. So I'm using the web. So if I ask the question, why is the sky blue? A question I often ask, it's answering it based on information that exists out in the public domain. Okay. However, if I go to the Work tab and I ask it a question, it's going to answer the question based on content that exists in my Microsoft 365 environment. So if I say, for instance, what's my next meeting? My next meeting apparently is tomorrow, 12:30, digital strategy meeting. These are the people, and I can drill into that a bit more details. If I ask a question of Copilot in terms of content, so I've asked the question here, what is the super secret project, key aims and objectives? And this has given me a response about the super secret project. Now, obviously, this is content that exists within my environment. It's not content that exists out on the public domain, or I'm hoping it's not, because it's sensitive content. Okay. And this is the area where we need to consider how Copilot interacts with our content and how well our content is managed. So if I just revert back to my slide deck and we just think about, first of all, what's happening here. I, as the user, am interacting with Copilot either directly or through Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Teams, Outlook, etc. But effectively, what's happening is Copilot is using my access. So it has access to everything that I have access to. And this is why it could answer what was my next meeting, because it knows what's in my mailbox. It also has access to OneDrive, so content within my OneDrive and other people's OneDrive that I, as an individual, have access to. It has access to content within SharePoint, likewise, that I have access to. And it has access to content within Teams that I have access to. So it effectively acts on my behalf. Now, you might think, well, what's the problem then? Why is there any concern or risks associated with what Copilot has access to? Well, you're right. It's not actually a risk of what Copilot has access to. The risk is how well your content is managed. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 common scenarios. And if you're thinking at the back of your mind, bingo, that applies to my organization, you will not be unusual, because this broadly applies to nearly every organization I've worked with over the last 20 years on a variety of SharePoint projects. So the first, probably most common one, is that within your Microsoft 365 environment, you've got out-of-date content. So you've got content that is maybe there because it's archived, maybe there because no one's taken responsibility for deleting it, maybe there that it's old content that's subsequently been replaced. But the problem with that content, from a Copilot point of view, is how does it differentiate between a policy or a process that's out of date and been superseded and one that hasn't? So that would be our first problem, out-of-date content. Second problem is non-authoritative copies of content. Now, this happens when people, for instance, download a copy of a policy, or they copy content somewhere, and the content that they've copied, that they are then relying on from that point onwards, has been superseded or is inaccurate, or maybe was a draft copy of the authoritative content. This is particularly important for things like policies, procedures, and guidance notes. But the same thing is very common, I see, with templates, document templates. You know, someone's spent the last 5 years always creating a report based on the same template, only to discover that template has been revised every year for the last 5 years, and they've been using one that's 5 years out of date. So non-authoritative content, sorry, copies of content. Overshared content. Now, I always love the fact that SharePoint is called SharePoint, and in its name explains one of its most common problems. It's super easy to share content in SharePoint, right? But the problem with sharing content is what happens is content gets unintendedly, usually, overshared with a broader audience or the entire organization when it doesn't need to be. And therefore, people have access to content that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. And therefore, because Copilot is using the permissions of the user, Copilot has access to content that's accidentally been overshared. And I stress the word accidentally because I'm not talking about scenarios where content is maliciously overshared. Oversharing accidentally is a far more common scenario than the malicious sharing of content. And the final point is content which contains sensitive information. And that is content that the user may be unaware the content they are looking at is sensitive. Now, I'm not talking about obvious ones like PII. I'm talking about something that might be intellectual property to your organization. A user might be entirely unaware what Copilot has responded with is content that is of a sensitive nature, and therefore they need to be aware and mindful of what they do with the content that's Copilot's generated. Now, out of those 4 scenarios, as I said, I'm sure some of you will say, yes, that applies to our content, or at least 3 out of the 4. But as I said, rest assured, every organization I work with, no matter how well regulated, how large, how small, if they're honest, will say we suffer from probably all of these. So the question is, how do we go about addressing this? Well, I'm going to talk about some scenarios to address these things and give you a flavour as what's possible. The extent to which you can apply these to your environment really depends on your environment, volume of content, sensitivity of content, use of the content. But hopefully what I show you will give you a little bit of a inspiration in terms of, okay, great, that sounds sensible. Here's some things we can do. So the first thing is out-of-date content. Now, I'm going to state the obvious here, which is delete the content you don't need. But although it's easy for me to say that, it's actually very difficult for organizations to delete content they don't need, because to be able to delete content you don't need, you need to establish who owns the content and whether that person accepts the fact that you no longer need that content. And that is not a technical problem, that is a kind of a process problem. But I will talk about some tools in terms of what we can do. The other one obviously is declutter your content by finding and removing inactive SharePoint sites. Now, if you're an organization that says, well, we've got 10 SharePoint sites, good for you. This is going to be a simple problem to resolve. But I work with organizations that measure their SharePoint sites in the hundreds of thousands, and therefore this is an issue for them. So let's have a look at a couple of things that we can do. So the first thing is within the SharePoint Admin Center, and for any non-technical people, I'm not going to get too technical on this before you worry. I'm just going to allude to a few capabilities that you might want to be aware of there. So I have an option that says active sites, and this will list all of your SharePoint sites in your environment. And one of the simple ways to have a look at this list is just to change the view and say, show me my least active sites. And that will filter the view or sort the view based on least active sites. It will tell me the last activity date, tell me the amount of content, etc. Now, just a point about this, just because the site's not active, it doesn't mean you don't need the content. Okay, so a site might have content that you need to retain for 40 years. Just because no one's accessed it doesn't mean that you don't need to retain it. So just be mindful that this can only take you so far in this analysis. But let's say I've got, say, 100 sites, 1,000 sites, 10,000 sites that aren't active. What am I going to do about that? Now, I could kind of do it manually, but Microsoft have provided a set of features that allow you to manage the life cycle of sites. So one of those features is called the inactive site policy. And what this allows you to do, I'll just start creating a new policy, is basically generate a report of inactive sites. So sites that have not seen an activity for a period of time. It will allow you to then generate emails that are automatically sent to the owner or admin of that site, asking that person to take action. And depending on the action they take, you can then decide to either automatically archive the site, set the site to read only, or do nothing with it. So for instance, if I just set the policy up, I can say, well, which sites do I want to include? I'm just going to say select every site. Who do I want to notify? I'll notify the site owner. And then what do I want to do? Okay, so this is inactivity for 6 months. I'm going to take some enforcement. I'm going to set the site to read only. Okay, if you have enabled Microsoft 365 Archive, you can basically archive the site. If I kick that process off, it will then do this in the background for me. Now, I've got one, obviously, I've done earlier. So here's a policy that I've set up. And this is running in what we call simulation mode, which means it won't actually do the actions I've told it to do. I use it as the basis just to understand the scale and extent of the problem. So if we go into here, this was run earlier last month, and it found 11 inactive sites. Now I can get a detailed report, which is a CSV file that gives me all the information, but I kind of like this, get AI insights. It's using AI to generate a summary of what's included in this report. So this is telling me that multiple inactive sites are owned by the same owner, Martin Bacon. There's a load of sites that are stored using very little storage, which means that archiving them isn't going to be an issue in terms of space, and none of the sites contain any sensitive information. So these are a useful mechanism just to get a grip of what's going on with the sites. Now, this inactive sites policy works very well on the basis that you have defined owners. So one of the problems that a lot of organizations face when they start doing this is, well, over the last 5 years, we've had lots of joiners, movers, and leavers, and they've generated a lot of sites. And we've got a lot of SharePoint sites that we're not actually sure who the owner is. So on the flip side, we have a different policy called the site ownership policy. And this basically allows you to specify a minimum criteria that a SharePoint site needs to support, such as having an owner, at least one owner. And if it doesn't, what actions to take. So like before, I'm just going to show you setting up a policy. So it generates a monthly report of sites that don't meet your standard, i.e. they don't have X number of owners or an admin. If you want it to, it'll generate a notification to try and find an owner. And if it can't find an owner, it can perform an action. So for instance, again, I'll just select all the sites. Click next. So who should be responsible for each site? Owners. I want at least 2 owners for each site. What happens if there isn't an owner? I like doing this. Find who is the most active site member and ask them the question. And what actions to take if the site remains ownerless for three or more months. Set it to read only. Don't do this. But in all seriousness, if you set it to read only, I guarantee someone will shout. And the person who shouts the loudest is the person that you might suggest could get ownership for the site. Okay, so that's how this policy works. Likewise, you can run it in simulation mode. So if I go into this one, it's said I've got 6 non-compliant sites. I could then activate this, and that will then send the emails and do what I've asked it to do. So both these policies are very useful at building those governance principles into your environment and automating them to ensure they are maintained. Okay. So that's an example of out-of-date content. There are many others like retention, but it's kind of for the purpose of today. I thought I'd just cover a couple of things. Otherwise, we'll spend the whole time talking about retention. So let me talk about non-authoritative content. So let me show you a quick example of this in action. So I'm going to go to my people intranet. So in my environment, I've got a SharePoint site that acts as my intranet for information about policies and procedures for people. And what I've got on this site is an agent, so an AI-driven agent that allows me to ask questions of it about employee policy and procedure. So I'm going to open my agent, and I'm going to ask the question, so can I wear a fancy dress to a client meeting? Seems like a sensible question to me. And what Copilot's doing here is looking through the content of this site to find out whether it can answer my question. And apologies if that's very small on the screen. I'm just trying to zoom in a little bit so you can see. So when attending a client meeting, it's important to dress appropriately, yada, yada, yada. Smart business casual, professional attire, meeting etiquette, fancy dress is not generally considered appropriate. Sounds sensible. Let me just contrast that. I'm going to go to Copilot. I'm going to go to my work tab, and I'm going to ask the same question. So, fancy dress to a client meeting. You can see I often ask the same question, hoping for the answer I'm looking for. Now, the difference here is that I'm just asking Copilot based on the content that I have access to. And looks what it looks, it's correctly referenced the employee handbook, but it's also said, however, this document introduces a more creative and expressive tone. It encourages the employee to incorporate fun and unique elements into their attire for customer meetings, such as playful hats, I'm all for a playful hat, colourful ties, or statement jewellery. Now, why is this contrasted and contradicted what the policy said? Well, it's simple. If I hover over this, well, it'll be simple for me because I know what it's telling me. That document is a document I made up and put in my OneDrive. And Copilot's answered with it because guess what? Copilot has access to all the content I have access to. So it's not differentiating between the fact, here's my made up wear fancy dress policy, and here's the official employee handbook. Okay. Now, the example maybe is a bit fictitious, but the reality is, in most organizations, you've got content that's authoritative and content that isn't. And the way that you can address this problem is by using what we call agents. So in my case here, my agent in this SharePoint site has been told, I just go and edit it here and go into sources, only to use content from this location. Okay, this is a location in SharePoint that stores all of our policies and procedures. it will not use my OneDrive, therefore. And so one of the ways to quickly address the issue with authoritative content is to use agents, either an agent in SharePoint, or I've got the same agent here, an agent in 365, which I can ask the same question to. And like my agent in SharePoint, this has been told where to go and get its content from. And therefore, to my disappointment, it says essentially that you need to speak to people support if you believe that what they're recommending here isn't, what you want to wear. Okay. So that's one of the ways that you can quickly address the problems of Copilot answering questions based on content that I as a user have access to, when actually you want it to answer questions based on your authoritative content. Now I'm going to come back to restricting and allowing Copilot access to sites in a moment, because it crosses over with one of the other scenarios. So let's talk about oversharing of content. So this is, if you remember, the scenario where content has been accidentally overshared to a wider group of people than would otherwise have access to it. Now, in reality, this happens very frequently in SharePoint. So I'm just going to show an example. Okay, so in Microsoft Teams, I have a team. And in that team, called Super Secret Project, the team, if we just have a look at this team itself, to manage team, go to settings, is a private team. Now, for those who don't know, that means that only the people who the owner of the team explicitly grants rights to have access to the team. Perfect, private. And I can see who's got access to this team. It's just myself, I'm the owner, and my colleague Colin. Yet, if I go into a document library in this team, and I've got this Word document, and let's just open this document. So this is a project brief, okay? And I click share. And I want to share this with, say, Colin, because Colin's asked me for a link to it. He's already got rights to it, no problem. I'll just share it with him. Perfect. I could click send, but before I click send, let's just look at what's actually going to happen. Link settings. It's going to generate a sharing link for these people, not just for Colin, right? It's going to create a sharing link for everyone in the organization. Why? Because that is the default behavior in your SharePoint environment that is configured. Now, there is a reason for this before you think, well, why did Microsoft do it like that? But for the purpose of oversharing content, this creates a problem, because most users, when they share content, aren't going to click that and look at what's happening. They'll just think, well, I've typed in Colin, I'll click send, all is good here, entirely unaware that what they've just created is a link that effectively everyone in the organization has access to. It's an editable link, which means you've given them edit rights to this document, and you have bypassed the security to your super secret team, because that single document in there, now we just click on share, and we click on who's got access to it. Oh, I didn't send it. It'll be accessible by everyone. Okay. So this issue is something that you do need to be aware of, and it is something that you need to address. Okay, and there's a few ways that you can address it. So the first one is, well, how common is this problem in our environment? How often does this happen? And one of the ways that you can go and see how often it happens is if you've got administrator rights to your environment and you go into the reports, usage reports, and then you go into SharePoint, and then you go into site usage, and I scroll down, one of the things this will tell you, if you want it to tell you, is which of your SharePoint sites has had created within it sharing links. Now, if I just go across here, choose columns, this will basically allow me to say, I want to see how many company links, that's a company-wide link, how many links for individual people, and possibly guest. But in the context of Copilot, we're not really interested in guest links. Click Save. And then if we have a look at this list with the horrible double scroll bars, and we go across company count, you can see here, these are SharePoint sites that have company-wide links to individual files within them. Now, this can't tell you whether those are legitimate or valid, but it can just tell you that they exist and they are happening, okay? And therefore, you might want to look at scenarios where that is happening. To address the problem, moving forward, within your SharePoint Admin Center, you can effectively go to your sharing policies here, and then you can effectively change them. So instead of it being this one, which is the default link in most people's environments, you can change it to that, okay? And you can either do this for your entire organization, or you can do it for specific SharePoint sites, okay? There's a few things to think about when doing this, but essentially there is a way of applying it moving forward. Now, you might be thinking, that's all very well, but what about retrospectively? I've discovered a site that has loads of links in it. How do I deal with bringing that site back to alignment? And the answer to that is, if you identify a site that is leaking like a sieve, if I can use that expression, the way to do it, or one way to do it, is I'm going to go to my site, super secret project, okay? And my site tells me James has got access and these two people have got, sorry, this person's got access as well. But I know, because the other reports told me, there's loads and loads of sharing links being created. So what I can do is go into settings, and I can say restrict site access. This basically says, if I apply this, only let people who are legitimate members of this group to have access to this site, and that will instantly block access to all of those sharing links. Now, you can go through the documents and files and get rid of the sharing links. This gives you a very quick way of tidying up access to a SharePoint site that's maybe got out of control in terms of its security model. Okay. One other thing that you might want to think about running periodically is there's a report here in SharePoint called Data Access Governance. And what this report allows you to do is have a list of sites that have people in your organization links, okay? So these, I don't know why Microsoft used different terminology for the same thing, but this is the link that gets generated that everyone in the organization has access to. Now, if you run this report, this will tell you that you've got some sites that fall foul of this. So it's telling me that the people site has this. What I can then do is click what we call a site access review, which sends emails to the site owner to say, you have got these documents in your site that someone has shared to the entire organization. Can you confirm that these are correct shares or not? And it pushes the responsibility onto the site owner. Now, that's you know, in this case, this site here, everyone has access to anyway. So there'd be no reason why someone would have created a sharing link legitimately. So the site owner can just delete them. But this is effectively the way that you review what's in your organization and trigger a process to allow you to start addressing those sites that have problems with oversharing. Again, hopefully, my analogy of if you've only got 10 SharePoint sites, you might be thinking, this seems like a lot of work. You're right, 10 SharePoint sites would be easy to look at. But as I said, when you've got the 10,000, 100,000 plus sites, these processes become very time consuming without using these tools and these policies to assist. Okay, so let's talk about scenario 4, sensitive content. So this is the scenario where I said that the user might be unaware that the information that they are having returned to them in Copilot is of a sensitive nature. Now, they've legitimately got rights to it. So we're not talking about overshared content. We're talking about content that the user has rights to, but they need to be aware that the content, the response that Copilot generated, is based on a piece of content that is sensitive. So just show a quick example of this. If I go back to Copilot, go back to chat, go back to work, and I just ask about the super secret project. So it's going away, it's finding content that I have access to, and it's generating a response based on that content that I have access to. So this is a combination of Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, etc. Okay, now, if I scroll to the top, you notice that I've got a little symbol there. And if I hover over the symbol, apologies, this is very small, it tells me highly confidential, very sensitive business data that was cause damage to the business if it was shared with unauthorized people, etc., etc. That is being shown because this document itself, the brief, has been tagged as being sensitive. Okay, so if I go to the document and open it, actually, that's not the right document. Okay. I now have a non-authoritative version of the document. Anyway, let me open it. So this content, which I'm just going to tag as being sensitive, yes, has highly confidential label applied to it. So for any of you that are looking at sensitivity labels, I'm not really going to cover it today, but effectively it allows you to stamp a document with a label that denotes its level of sensitivity. And in doing so, you can apply controls and policies in your environment that govern what the person can or can't do with it. So you can see I've got very simple, public, general, confidential, highly confidential. And for each of those, I've given it a description of what that means. Okay. Now, you can see there that Copilot has effectively said, I've generated a response, but the documents that have been used to generate this response, some of them have been tagged with confidential information. So the response is confidential. And this also applies to other scenarios in Copilot. So if, for instance, just give us that second. So let's say you've seen my Word document and my Word document is tagged with that. If I go to generate a new Word document, okay, so generate a summary of this document. Okay, so I picked that document here. So I'm getting Copilot to generate content based on another content. You see it knows. As soon as I click that, it'll generate this content. But what it'll also do, you saw that pop up, due to content created by Copilot, your organization automatically applied the label highly confidential. So basically, because this new content has been generated based on content that itself is sensitive, the new content is also flagged as sensitive, even though at the moment I haven't told it where to save it. I could save this to my OneDrive, but it's still going to be flagged with the highly confidential content. Now, one thing that often I get asked is, we haven't implemented this stuff, so we're a bit worried about Copilot having access to content that the user does have access to, but we don't want Copilot to generate responses based on that content. What do we do about it? Well, the easiest answer is, if I go back to my SharePoint admin, go into my sites, go to my super secret project, and in settings, I've got a setting here that says restrict content from Copilot. If I turn it on there, that will prevent Copilot from using that content full stop. Okay, so it just wouldn't be returned in responses. So this can be a good way if you're, you haven't restricted sensitivity, you've got a SharePoint site that's really sensitive, and you just think, let's just exclude it from Copilot. That's how you can do that. Okay. Now, I hope in terms of what I've been showing you there gives you a flavor that all of these common scenarios have multiple ways of addressing them or mitigating the risks that they present. Okay. Now, it would be remiss of me not to point out something to do with licensing, and apologize in advance to do with this. Microsoft licensing is fairly complicated, but everything that I've shown you today is typically included within Business Premium or Microsoft E3. And you can see these the list of the features that I've included. Today, I haven't shown you anything that would be included in the E5, or for Business Premium people, the E5 equivalent. But I have showed you a couple of features that are included as part of something called SharePoint Advanced Management, which is an add-on license. However, at the beginning of the year, Microsoft confirmed that some of the features, i.e. some of the features I've shown you today, will be provided to you as part of your Microsoft 365 Copilot license. Okay. So what I've tried to do is show you things that you would typically have access to, obviously depending whether you're Business Premium or E3, and not focus on things that you may not have access to because their prerequisite is the E5. You will get a copy of these slides, and Microsoft provide documentation around this stuff, although it's not always easy to find an answer. But if you've got questions about licensing, I'm sure Mike will be happy to answer those.
Thanks, James.
Okay, so here's a question I always get answered. I wish I would have answered it. Here's a question I always get asked. Where do we start, and where do we need to get to before we enable Copilot? Well, this is a diagram taken from the Microsoft documentation. And whilst it's kind of a bit nuanced and it doesn't apply to all, I think it explains a lot. You don't need to mitigate all of these risks to deploy Copilot, okay? Because if you said, do you know what, we're going to get all of our house in order and then we'll deploy Copilot, I'll say, I'll mark a note in my calendar for 2035 or beyond when you've actually done that and you're ready to deploy Copilot. Effectively, data governance and content governance when it comes to SharePoint is a lifelong commitment. It's not a one-off process, okay? So great, embark on the journey. Great, understand where you currently are, understand the risks you potentially expose, But in terms of deploying Copilot, you don't need to get all of those things resolved. So Microsoft talk about, deploy it and discover oversharing risks. Look at methods to understand site ownership and inactive sites, understand sensitive data. But this is a journey, it's not a destination. And your biggest risk when you implement Copilot is the person using it, because Copilot doesn't do anything that the user themselves doesn't have to confirm. And remember, Copilot will only return to the user information they already have access to. So all of this stuff I've talked about is great. You don't need to do it all day one. You definitely need to talk to your users day one, and we'll talk about that in the subsequent webinar. But I would say to you that this isn't a case of get everything right before you deploy Copilot, okay? Now, one of the things that we've been doing is working with organizations to help them get going. And part of that is the creation of a set of accelerators that are targeted at organizations to say, okay, let's get you going with Copilot. And depending on where you want to get to in your first, if you like, sprint or your first iteration, we have 3 separate packages. And these basically just kind of say, if really all you want to do is deploy Copilot Chat, which is the one that only uses content in the public domain, a lot of what I've talked about today isn't entirely relevant because it's never going to respond based on content in your environment. If, however, you are looking at the Copilot paid for edition, and therefore it will respond based on content the user has access to, then we suggest the standard or premium, because as part of that, we will help you understand your data, your content, and your policies as they are today. Again, just to be clear, what you might elect to do about that isn't necessarily an overnight fix. So if, for argument's sake, as an organization, you're very keen on implementing retention and data lifecycle management policies, great. But it's not an overnight fix. It's a journey to go on, and it's something that you can make a start on, and you can then deploy Copilot in parallel to the work that you're doing. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Mike.
Thank you, James. A really informative session as always. I think over the years, I've certainly seen a lot of the risks, especially around the overshared content. But it was clear from the demo that's an issue that needs to be addressed before it becomes a bigger problem. And you can see just from the sharing links how easy that is to become a problem. I also really like the example of the rollout plan. I think we've had 2 people message me directly to say, can they get a copy? Yes, you can. We will be sharing the slides. We'll make sure to send it out with the recording. And just on the recording, so as this is a 3-part webinar series, the first recording is already on the website. The recording for today will be sent out along with the slides. And for anyone who hasn't yet registered, we will be running the next webinar on the 12th of June. It's focused all around the people and prepping those people for a smooth adoption of Copilot. We'll be again kind of exploring some of the key risks of the users and how to mitigate those with some straightforward activities. And what I'll do is I'll paste the link to the 3rd webinar in the chat now. I'll do that, and then I can see there's a couple of questions in the chat, so we will come on to those shortly. So moving on to the feedback and the Q&A section. So before we dive into that, I'd like to ask everyone who has a phone in front of them if they could kindly scan the QR code and tell us how we've done. We do thrive on the feedback, and we do make adjustments based on the comments that you leave us. So that would be great if you can. There is also an option to book a session directly with James. This is a free of charge, technically led session to run through your Copilot scenarios. So be it around the overview, be it around the users, be it around the governance, the security compliance of the data aspects that you have around Copilot. Book it in, you get a free hour with James, and it's a good sounding board to get advice from somebody who's living and breathing Copilot, and who speaks to a lot of organizations of all different shapes and sizes, so brings that insight into those sessions. And also, any questions on those accelerators that James highlighted on the previous slide, do let us know. We can run through those and tailor those accordingly. So we have approximately 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do now is invite you all to post your questions into the Q&A tab at the top, and we'll run through those now. And I'll start with the first question in the meeting chat. So James, somebody's posted, grant Copilot access to popular low-risk sites. So that is specifically granting access rather than restricting Copilot's use of it. That's the question.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm going to I think, yeah, it relates to this. So yes, there is a feature that's referred to called restrictive SharePoint search. And what this diagram is alluding to here is that if you want to deploy Copilot, and instead of doing work to analyze all of the sites, if you already know you've got a small subset of sites that you think, I only want Copilot to respond to those sites, okay? There is something called restrictive SharePoint search, which effectively is a include list of sites for Copilot to use. So what happens is when you enable this capability, only the sites that you include in it, Copilot will respond to. So I'm going to caveat in a minute, it's a great way of saying Copilot will only have access to these sites that we as an organization have confirmed we're okay for Copilot to use. It's in contrast for restricted content discovery, which is where you exclude sites specifically. Okay, now the difference is that with restricted SharePoint search, it doesn't just restrict Copilot access, unfortunately, it actually restricts SharePoint search from an enterprise level from returning content from those sites that aren't in the included list. So if I've got 100 sites I've included, and I've got one site I've excluded, my super secret project, then great from a Copilot point of view, it won't respond to content that exists in the super secret project, but neither will SharePoint search unless the user goes directly to the SharePoint site and does the search. Now, apologies if that comes over quite technical, but in my experience, restricted SharePoint search, which is what's being talked about here, is a very temporary restriction to apply to give you a bit of breathing space if you need it to address broader content governance concerns. It is not something long term that you want to leave enabled, primarily because that content won't be returned in SharePoint search either, and B, there's only a small number of sites that you can include, so it gets to the point where it's not scalable. But this is why in the Microsoft documentation they updated it recently to say this bit's optional. They probably should have said this bit's optional, but as I said, this is just guidance, right? It's kind of it's to help you understand how you might do this. Most people I work with start with this, but instead of deploying for the whole organization, they basically deploy Copilot paid for license to a subset of users, and those subset of users, part of their responsibility is to help discover some of these things. Now, again, I'm generalizing because depending on your industry sector, depending on size of organization, depending on risk, everyone's subtly different. But generally, most people I work with fit within a pilot, but to a subset of users, and don't deploy this thing of restricted SharePoint search because it is just such a temporary solution.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I've got a message from someone who wants to remain anonymous. They've messaged me direct. Do we need to address all the potential risks prior to deployment of Copilot? It's a great question.
No. So that hopefully I've kind of echoed my point that even according to Microsoft, get going with it straight away. The process to address content governance in SharePoint as I said, is a lifelong commitment. So I think what I'd suggest all organizations do is understand the potential risk, right? Address the primary risk, which is the user not understanding what Copilot's doing, the user not understanding what Copilot's responding with. Address that from a user education point of view, and then over time, identify areas within your content that represent the highest risk. So is it out-of-date content? Is it sensitive content? Is it a subset of SharePoint sites that are overly shared? And just focus on the areas that you get your, biggest bang for your buck in terms of spending the time and effort on resolving those issues.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I think we've got time for a couple more. Next question. So looking to migrate content from our file servers into SharePoint. I think we've spoken to a few customers today ourselves, James, with that scenario. And I'm looking to deploy Copilot. Where should I start?
Well, you're in the luxurious position that you won't have any of the problems we're talking about because none of your content exists within SharePoint. However, what I would suggest is that so that you don't lift and shift and create a whole load of problems day one, that you do be clear before you start migrating content from a file share. Some of these governance points that I've alluded to today, like site ownership, like retention, like sensitivity, get them planned up front before you move all the content in. Try and make sure your empty house is in order before you start filling it with all of your content. And I appreciate that's not always possible to do because people are under time constraints to move content from legacy file shares into SharePoint. I get that, but it will pay you dividends if you do that little bit extra effort in planning and at least deciding some of these principles: retention, ownership, sensitivity in advance of moving that content over.
Yeah, it sounds like it would save them a lot of time there. So I think, James, that's covered all the questions that we've had direct or in the Q&A or in the chat. So what I will do, I'll paste that link again for the next session and the feedback form. Again, we really value your feedback to these sessions. And James, just a big thank you for today. Thank you for your knowledge, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the next session on the 12th of June. Again, that copy of the recording and slides will be sent out tomorrow. And thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.